During a 1957 climb of Haramosh Peak, Tony Streather and John Emery beat everything the mountain could throw at them. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for the rest of their climbing. From frostbite to lost gear to avalanches, these men went through hell and back on the mountain. Mount Haramosh was first noted in 1947 by a Swiss expedition, and in 1955 a German team investigated the northeastern route, but the Rakaposhi-Haramosh sub-mountain range, tucked away in the Karakoram, remained largely unknown. Intent to change this, the University of Oxford Mountaineering Club set out to climb Haramosh in 1957. The team consisted of 5 climbers. Tony Streather was the expedition leader and oldest member of the team at 31. A professional soldier, he had been a member of the 1953 American K2 expedition, part of the team that completed the first descent of Kanchenjunga in 1955. The rest of the team were all in their 20s, with Bernard Geoffrey, John Emery, Ray Culbert, Scott Hamilton, plus the porters. At the end of July, the group reached Gilgit. Here they met their Hunza porters and headed for Haramosh. For a while, the team tried to access the mountains from the north and the west, but they eventually realized that these routes were impossible. They moved to Cutwall Valley and saw a long ridge to the northeast that would lead to the top of the mountain. To reach the top, the route passed first through Haramosh 2. The section from Haramosh 2 to Haramosh 1 was long, tedious, full of crevasses, and featured a dangerous glacier. They started the route with great difficulty because of bad weather. It kept snowing and the slopes were overladen. Access to Camp 1 and Camp 2 was difficult. Radio Pakistan was providing weather predictions for the next day to the team, but could not offer them good news. The climbers had already been on the mountain for a month and a half, and they had little time left. Hamilton stayed at Camp 3 and the porters descended to the lower camps. Emery and Culbert reached Camp 4 below Haramosh 2, 300 meters below the crest of the northeast ridge. Geoffrey and Streather advanced a little further, but they returned to Camp 4. By September 15th, Streather, Emery, Geoffrey, and Culbert were all at Camp 4. They woke up to good weather, and at 11 a.m. they began to ascend. Streather was the first to reach the crest. At the top, he was stunned by the beauty of the landscape. They descended a few feet and sat down in a safe place, just before the slope became vertiginous. It was their last day and they wanted to make the most of it. Although they knew that they had no chance to complete the route, nor to crown Haramosh, they were very happy to have fulfilled their main objective, which was to explore the mountain. Before descending, Geoffrey wanted to climb a little higher, toward a pinnacle, to better see their surroundings and the valley below them. He asked Emery to come with him. Streather and Culbert stayed on the crest and took photographs. Suddenly, there was a huge explosion. Everything happened in an instant. The snow under Geoffrey and Emery's feet began to move, and the 2 climbers, like dolls, slid down the slope. They fell into a snow basin 300 meters below. When Streather looked over the abyss, he feared the worst. However, Geoffrey and Emery were alive and managed to unearth themselves from the avalanche debris. But they were trapped, surrounded by walls of ice and snow. During the fall, they had both lost their ice axes. Geoffrey lost a glove, Emery lost both gloves, and had also suffered a hip dislocation. Streather and Culbert threw a backpack with warm clothing at them, but the backpack fell into a different crevasse. Geoffrey and Emery tried to climb up, but couldn't. They embraced for the night in a terrible bivouac at the bottom of the snow basin. Streather and Culbert decided their only option was to try to climb down to the stricken climbers. The descent was very dangerous. It was practically vertical. The situation only got worse. Culbert lost one of his crampons. The 2 rescuers were suddenly in a very difficult situation. Finally, in the late afternoon, the 2 men made it to Geoffrey and Emery, but in the process, Streather lost his ice axe. The reunion was emotional, but they weren't out of the woods yet. The 4 tied up and began to climb up out of the basin. It was their only escape route. At one point, Culbert, having only 1 crampon, slipped and fell, dragging the other 3 with him. They were once again at the bottom of the snow basin. Some of the group began to suffer from frostbite. Culbert's was particularly bad. Emery already had frostbite on his hand, and Geoffrey was delirious. The 4 embraced under the frozen sky. Early the next morning, they tried again. They had not eaten or drunk for 2 days. Streather decided this time was better without the rope. Emery, who was leading, managed to retrieve Streather's ice axe from the wall, and they had reached the traverse, the most critical stretch. They only needed to descend a little, and then could continue down to the lower camps. Emery and Streather made it, but Culbert had a major handicap, climbing with just one crampon. Streather climbed back up to Culbert to help him with the rope, but Culbert slipped and, taking Streather with him, slid back into the snow basin. Now the rescuers and casualties had switched places, but Emery and Geoffrey were very sick, dehydrated, and had frozen hands. They were in no position to mount a rescue. Streather and Culbert had survived the fall, but night fell again. Emery and Geoffrey set off for Camp 4. They knew they had to get there where there was food and drink before heading back to the basin to try to rescue Streather and Culbert. Geoffrey staggered ahead, but Emery, delirious, struggled to keep up. The two quickly realized that the footsteps that they were following did not lead to Camp 4. The footsteps suddenly disappeared. With horror, Emery realized that Geoffrey had fallen almost 2,000 meters into the void. He yelled his name several times, but there was no response. Geoffrey was clearly dead. Despite severe frostbite, Emery eventually made it to Camp 4 and collapsed. Meanwhile, Streather and Culbert had realized they could not endure another night. They tried to get out of the snow basin, and Streather succeeded, but again Culbert fell, further damaging his hip. Culbert could barely move. Streather had to continue to Camp 4 alone, where he found Emery half-conscious. Streather learned of Geoffrey's disappearance and went to the edge of the slope to call out Geoffrey's name. He couldn't believe that Geoffrey was dead. They both wanted to go back to save Culbert, but they could not use their hands. They were dehydrated, and both had severe frostbite. Streather knew that he could only save Emery. He helped him descend to Camp 3, where they met Hamilton. Hamilton at first thought that his teammates had found a better route, but on the third day his concerns started to grow. He did not know what to do and could see nothing from Camp 3. He constantly prepared food and drink for his colleagues, who did not show up. It was a tremendous shock to him when he learned that Culbert and Geoffrey had died. Finally, Hamilton took the two down to Camp 1, where the porters helped evacuate the survivors from the mountain.